Welcome again to our Global Harmonization Initiative webinar series. After a short holiday break, we are back again, and I'm honored to announce today's webinar on genetically modified plant food. This webinar is hosted by the GHI GM-based plant foods working group. For those of you who don't know yet, the overall mission of this working group is to make the discussion around genetically modified plants. And the working group's focus is to address and explain the potential benefits and risks associated with the use of biotechnology in plant breeding, resulting in plants that fall under the definition of genetically modified plants. This webinar will focus and discuss a recent development in the regulatory landscape of genetically modified plants for use in food for humans, especially within the European Union and in Africa, and more particularly in Kenya. Let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Diana Bogiva, and I'm the GHI Working Group Director. It is my pleasure to welcome you all that join us today, and I can promise you we'll have a wonderful, knowledge-inspiring time. I'm really pleased to announce our amazing speakers today. We have Professor Dr. Stefan Jansson, who is a professor in plant cell and molecular biology at Umeå Plant Science Center and Umeå University, Sweden. And he's a chair of the GHI Genetically Modified Based Plants Foods Working Group. Also with us today is Dr. Bernard Olo, lecturer of food science and technology of Egerton University, Kenya, and he's a member of GHI Genetically Modified Based Plant Food Working Group. Please, let's welcome together our wonderful speakers and yourself being part of our great audience. Together, we will discover the many safety aspects of the use of genetically modified based plants and many more. Before we start, I wish to announce the upcoming second GHI World Congress on Global Food Safety and Security, which is going to be held from 18th to 20th of March next year, 2024, in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. This international congress will explore the theme stepping up the transition of the global food system to a sustainable future. From 1st of April, the abstract submission will be open. Please stay tuned. I will encourage you to submit your abstract outlining your proposed presentations. We will expect you all and we'll be delighted to see you face-to-face in Rotterdam next year. For more information, you can go to www.ghiworldcongress.org. Also, before we immerse ourselves into the special talk and the Q&A session after each of the talks, of course, I encourage you and expect you to write in the question area as many as possible questions you have. I would like to thank ICC for providing this platform to enable our presentations and this very promising, important and meaningful conversation. Also, big thanks goes to GHI webinar team, including Dr. Nicholas Stanley, our GHI Communication Director, Dr. Gerhard Schlenning, who has many roles in GHI, but today he wears the hat of our technical guru, and Dr. John Tank, who works behind the scenes with Nicola, Gerhard, and myself to make this webinar happen. Thank you all again for joining us today. Without your support, our webinars will be not as exciting as we are going to have in a minute. Without any further delay, let me introduce you our first speaker, Professor Dr. Stefan Jansson, who is a professor in plant cell and molecular biology at Umeå Plant Science Center at Umeå University, Sweden, and he's a chair of the GHI Genetically Modified Plant-Based Food Working Group. Professor Jansson is a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences, and the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry. He has for many years been very active in the discussions around genetically modified plants, including the regulatory status of genome editing plants. He'll be talking about how should the genetics of the 2020s become useful for society. Welcome, Stefan. Our virtual floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And as I said, I'm professor in plant cell and molecular biology. I should say right from the beginning that I'm not breeder. I'm mainly working in basic science, but I've been much involved in these discussions and so on. And I guess it has some, you will understand more when I do this presentation, that I will talk more about more general things, not really say that we can, with biotechnology, do this or that. It will be more about science and society. So, but we use a lot of genetics in our basic research. And of course, we have gone far away from where genetics all started quite some time ago. And there have been some amazing development in the last 10 or 15 years that I will dwell upon a little bit later into this presentation. But as I said, I used to talk about genetically modified plants quite often, and I never do this without starting to talking about plant breeding in general. I mean, maybe you know it, but there are so many people that really don't understand what plant breeding is about. And I used to phrase it like this: it's actually the art of finding good mutants and keeping them. And throughout most of our history, this has happened just although no one knew what they were doing. I used to illustrate that with cabbage. This is the wild cabbage growing in the Mediterranean area. And now we're eating a lot of different types of cabbages. Here, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, and cauliflower, and so on. And these are the same species that pretty much by accidents happen to be found by some farmer somewhere. Some farmer once upon a time found a cabbage that had a mutation in a gene that's necessary for making branches. So instead of making branches, the branches did not elongate, so all the leaves originated from the same space. And then instead of a branch formed a little ball. That particular farmer was clever enough to keep seeds of this plant, and the next generation saw them out, and then the offspring looked the same, and today we are eating the descendants of that plant as Brussels sprouts. Another farmer somewhere found a mutation, again a spontaneous mutation in the gene necessary for stem elongation. So then on that particular plant, the stem was actually swelling up like a small ball that became kohlrabi. Another farmer somewhere found a mutation in the gene necessary for making the flower, the inflorescence develop. And then the whole part here developed into something that you may call kind of more or less a tumor. It's not a tumor, but anyway, it's a big white structure that we eat and appreciate as cauliflower nowadays. So these are all 1 or 2 gene mutations in the cabbage that was being grown over large part, in particular Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And the farmers, of course, they selected these ones. They didn't understand that they were doing the genetics. There was no such word as plant breeding at that time, but still it worked. It shows the power of natural variation and how to combine them later on in breeding. But in the 1860s, I guess you heard about this guy, Gregor Mendel, who was counting peas in his monastery garden in Brno. And he sorted out the laws of genetics. And when his work was rediscovered around year 1900, that's when really science-based plant breeding took off. And breeders started to cross the different varieties that they had to each other in a more organized way. And relatively soon after this has happened, already in the 1930s or so, plant breeders realized that what was limiting their progress in terms of developing new varieties, that's actually the amount of variation that was there in the beginning. Of course, if you have a cauliflower, you can cross it to a broccoli and so on. But if you don't have these things that looks different from the beginning, there is nothing to cross. So then there was a lot of efforts done to increase variation. Seeds were exposed to radiation. This is the Institute of Radiation Breeding in Japan, which I think is still active. You can also expose seeds or plants to mutagens. For us, this is very dangerous because some of these ones cause cancer. And we should also say that basically for plants, most of these mutations that were induced using these techniques, they were very unbeneficial for the plants, perhaps 99.99%. But again, the art of making breeding is finding the ones that are good among a lot of others that could be bad. And this is what's been developed by breeders also. So you induce a lot of variation and then have your breeding tools to find the good ones. So, and this mutation breeding, that has only been one of the techniques that the breeders of today are using. So this is just some overview of some of the things that those that actually develop the varieties that we're eating now, the techniques that they are using. And they are color coded here because all the green ones, this is where they kind of started and they are still in use. The green ones, breeders do that without, I should say, any regulation in any country whatsoever. So every breeder can do what they want and develop new varieties, and there is no authority or so that tries to consider, is this good or bad? Of course, the breeders don't want to sell varieties that are bad, that are toxic and don't produce well or so. That's obvious because they want to do it to make money and for themselves and for the farmers. But take-home messages, there is no regulation whatsoever on all the techniques that are green, but there is one, and that is transformation, which when this was developed back in the 1980s, so society was rightfully a bit worried that it could be problematic, and that's the different regulations were developed in different countries. So we'll talk more about this. And at the end, I will also talk about now the new things that we're doing with gene editing in CRISPR, whether that should be regulated or not. And there are some differences over the world. So, but I mentioned this about transformation. What actually scientists found out at that time was that there is a soil bacterium named Agrobacterium, which is a wild soil bacterium that causes disease in some plants, relatively few in fact, but there are a few plants that can get infected by this bug and get tumors. Scientists found that there are no bacteria in the tumor. The only thing which is in the tumor is a few genes that were in the genome of this bacteria when it's infected. So what the bacteria actually did, that it transferred a few genes into the genome of the plant, causing a tumor. This is actually quite similar to what viruses are doing. I mean, we talked so much about viruses in the last years. Viruses, they infect our cells, they inject little RNA and DNA, and they take over the metabolism of our cells so that we're producing new viruses that when we cough or sneeze and so can go out and infect others. So they insert a little DNA, and these guys inserted a little DNA. But when plant scientists understood this, they also understood how, if we take this, the DNA, if we know which DNA that is inserted into the plant, if we take this DNA out and in that particular place in the genome, put back the DNA, some DNA that we want to have into a new plant, then the bacteria will do the job. So this is basically what was developed in the 1980s, and that is the biological background to almost all genetically modified plants. There are some other techniques. You can actually shoot in the DNA with small projectiles or gold or tungsten and so, but that's more of the exception. So most plants, this is the way that this is done. And it's actually, for many plants, extremely easy to do this. So the genetics of 2020s that I had in the title, what do I mean with that? Well, this is what most of us in plant science are doing right now. We are looking at naturally domesticated plant populations, finding a lot of variation. We use DNA sequencing to basically identify all genetic variation that there is there. You can now, for a relatively low cost compared to before, sequence the whole genome of plants. If you have that, if you have plants, know the sequence, then you have the tools to identify the genes that are governing important traits, like growth, drought resistance, susceptibility to pathogens and so on. And if you have identified the genes behind these traits, you can actually use this knowledge to design new crops. So we know really a lot about this. So now the question is, how should we get this into society? And why this has actually been a revolution more or less in the last 20 years. And it's two things that made this possible. One is on the side of DNA sequencing. I was involved in a project started around 20 years ago to sequence the first genome of a tree. That was funded at that time by US Department of Energy. They set aside $30 million to get the first genome out. They didn't spend all this money, but at least it was very expensive at that time. We published a couple of years ago a paper, just an example, where we took 500 different populous individuals and sequenced them and looked for connections to variation and so on. And the sequencing cost of those 500, that was just $100,000 US. So there is a total revolution in the cost reduction. That means that what was not feasible only 10 years ago is now more or less standard technique. You can go out and choose hundreds of individuals and then you get their full genome sequences. So that is one leg of this. And the other leg is, of course, the new techniques that, since I'm working in Umeå, we are extremely proud here that the key publication of this happened when Emmanuel Chapelier was working here in Umeå, which is right in the house over there. And developed the genome editing. Genome editing was possible even before CRISPR-Cas9 was invented, but it was very inefficient. So now it's something that we can do. In some plants it goes very easy, others are a little bit more complicated, but still it works very well. So these things combined is what we can now do very interesting things. And of course, why do we need biotechnology to do things? Well, we don't need biotechnology. You can do many things with classical breeding, but things go so much quicker if you can use biotechnology. I'm using here the example of potato. Potato breed is grown throughout the world, and there is one major pest. There are several pests, but the by far biggest one is potato late blight, which is caused by Phytophthora, kind of a fungus. And this potato originates from South America, so does the pathogen. And first the potatoes came over to Europe, then the pathogen came a couple of hundred years later, and then it spread throughout the world. So this is a problem for potato growers throughout the world, however you do it, because under some conditions, a big fraction of the crop will be lost unless you spray them with fungicides. Of course, in South America, the pathogen and the potatoes has been there for millions of years. So there are resistant potato varieties that don't get infected by this. Of course, if you would be breeder, you can say then you just take an infected one or a resistant one and you cross it with one of the potatoes that we eat here, and then you will get something which is useful. And yes, it is. The problem is if the potatoes that we eat, they have been on 10,000 years of domestication. So they have very many good and important traits that are not there in the wild potato. So if you cross this to wild potato, which is resistant, you will get something which is right in between, which is really bad. Actually, it's producing very little potatoes that are toxic and so on. You could do this with a long-term back-crossing strategies, and people have been doing this for decades, but actually are not there yet. There are some varieties that could be cultivated reasonably well and have resistance. The problem is that they are still not yielding so much that you will see these varieties in the shop, because the farmers, they actually make more money either by growing the susceptible ones or spraying, or even growing the susceptible ones and not spraying, because you still get typically some potatoes out of it. So there is resistance there, but the problem is that it's not easy to get it where you want. You could just take the gene from the resistant variety and put it in one of our domesticated potatoes with biotechnology, and then you will immediately get a variety which is resistant and keeps all the traits of the other one. But then it becomes a GMO. So although this is a field experiment now done 20 years ago in Sweden, so it's been known for decades that it works, but it's not used anywhere because, as we'll talk, there is in reality very hard to, sometimes even impossible, to get the GMO out on the market. My own research is about photosynthesis. We are trying to understand how plants harvest sunlight, and there are many different chlorophyll binding proteins involved in this. My task has been trying to find out what is this particular protein doing in contrast to this one, and so on. We have, over the years, I've been doing this for 25 years, and we've been using different techniques to create mutants that are lacking. First, we want one plant that lacks protein 1, then we want another plant lacking protein 2, and then, of course, we would like to see what can plant 1 do that plant 2 cannot do, and so on. And this is how we sort this out. And we've been using different techniques. They varied over every decade, comes something new, basically. And but these 3 techniques that are labeled here in red, those are the ones that are falling under the definition of genetically modified plants. It's only in one case out of the dozen of proteins that we've been looking at that we have also mutants that have been produced using radiation or mutagenic chemicals. So when we compare the ones that we produce by technology with the ones that are produced by these random techniques, of course, we know that the ones done by biotechnology, that's a safe one, because we know exactly what we've been doing here. If we should try to publish a scientific paper on an EMS mutant that has a specific phenotype, of course, the reviewers will tell us, well, you don't know, this is because that particular gene is mutated because there are also perhaps 100 other genes mutated. So in order to make the causal link between phenotype and mutation, we need to do it in a controlled way using agrobacterium-based transformation and so on. So the green ones here in science, they are the unsafe ones, and the red ones are the safe. And in society, it's the other way around, because the green ones here, they can be grown by anyone everywhere in the world without a permit. And the red ones can basically not be grown by anyone outside of a lab. So, but we have, as you all know, a very polarized discussion about GMOs. We have the scientific community that many times has said that there are no evidence that crops that have been developed with the techniques that are labeled with green in the beginning are less risky or dangerous or so than those that were developed with the red technique. This we know from science. Still, there are many people that are angry and upset about these things and don't want to that they are used in society. So you may ask, why is it so polarized? And there is actually probably no other question where there is such a big gap between what scientists say and the public belief. This is an American investigation that was done a couple of years ago, where they asked random scientists, and compared it with random adults. For instance, they asked, do you believe in evolution? Only 2/3 of the American public believed in evolution at that point, and 98% of the scientists did. There were 2% that didn't believe it. It's probably, I don't know, people in economics or history or religion or literature or so. So there was not 100%. Neither was it that humans were behind climate change. There was only 87% of the scientists that believed in that, whereas the public, only 50% believed that. But there were more scientists that believed that GMO was safe than there were scientists that believed that humans were behind climate change. Whereas the public, they were on the other side there. Then basically 2/3 thought it was dangerous, while only 1/3 thought it was safe. So this is, as I said, why do we have a situation like this? What I would like to stress is that in most cases, if you don't understand something, you need to ask, this is what you do in criminal investigation, who's follow the money, who's gaining from having a situation like this? And this is why, when it comes to GMOs, there are public opinion and legislations pay little attention to what we scientists say. They believe in myths like GMOs or that's kind of the same thing as multinational companies, that they increased pesticide use could be toxic, could have uncontrolled changes, there is no independent risk research and so on. So, but how come? Well, I will give you 5 examples where I think that there are important players in society that benefit from status quo. And we can start with, really call it here, people that you trust. And here I'm talking about the environmental movement. That is, I must say, I'm very happy that this is something that has become much more important now compared to when I was a kid. So now people in general think that environmental NGOs and so on, they have an important role in society, and they have a lot of trust. But that doesn't mean that they are right in everything. And the example of golden rice is quite good there. You probably have heard of golden rice, where with biotechnology has got more vitamin A precursor in them. And that was developed now over 20 years ago, and the intention was to give that out, to provide it for free to farmers who wanted to grow it to prevent vitamin A deficiency. And last year there was actually finally it's coming out to the market in a couple of countries, but it has taken over 20 years. And of course, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons has been that there's been a very ambitious campaign against this. For instance, Greenpeace, a couple of years ago, you can read in their homepage that golden rice is environmentally irresponsible, poses risk to human health, and could compromise food, nutrition, and financial security. So that was the position of that organization. In, I think it was 2017 and so, when one of the Nobel laureates at that actually tried to make a list. He wrote an open letter and tried to get as many Nobel laureates to sign this. It was 108 in the beginning. I think they ended up in 130 or so, which is almost half of the ones that were alive at that point. And that open letter actually accused Greenpeace for a crime against humanity, since they were against GMOs in particular, in general, and golden rice in particular. And of course, if you would be a communication officer of Greenpeace, that's not very good news to hear the Nobel Prize community is accusing you for a crime against humanity. You may say, okay, why didn't they say we were wrong? But it's not so easy. In particular for an organization like Greenpeace that have decided right from the beginning that we don't take money from governments, we only take it from donations from people. So then they need to motivate themselves for the public that what they are doing is important. Here there are, this is in Swedish, and it's now 10 years ago. I will explain you why I can't do it now. But at that time, of course, I wanted to follow the GMO discussion in Sweden, so I was Googling GMO to see what's been written in the last week or so. And then when I, the other day, wanted to see what is on TV tonight, then I get an ad from Greenpeace who says here in Swedish, help us to stop GMO, donate money to us. Because then Greenpeace have bought the Google AdWord, GMO, because they believe that if I Google GMO, then I would like to stop GMO and I wanted to donate money to Greenpeace. This also happened when this particular case this is the guy who developed the golden rice that here got the prize from the Pope. And also here came this ad from Greenpeace. And of course they did this because they thought that people in general believe that GMOs are bad and they want to stop them. So that's a good marketing policy to do that and say that we are against it, give us money. I said this was 10 years ago because about that time, then that changed in Sweden. So since then, Greenpeace Sweden have not used this in the marketing campaigns, because in Sweden, this is not a big issue. Swedes tend to believe very much in science, and also in this case. So the average Swede doesn't think that GMO is something that we want to stop. So now they don't do it in Sweden. But still, if you look at worldwide, they have brought in so much money for saying that donate money to us because we want to stop GMO. So then it's not so easy to say, okay, guys, we were wrong for 20 years. GMOs are fine. So they have been too successful in the past to change now. You say the industry may want to do it. Well, that's if you're an industry that producing seeds. If you're an industry producing pesticides, efficient plant breeding is actually bad news, because if the plants are resistant to insects or fungi, you don't need chemical pesticides. On average, there's 37% less chemicals on the GMO field than on a field of non-GMO plants. So of course, if you're a chemical industry, you're not particularly happy about this. So the industry is divided. Those that sell us food in the shop, they have a very special situation, which I will illustrate here with the milk from our local dairy sold in the northern part of Sweden. Up to a couple of years ago, there was a small sticker on this one on the label saying that our cows are getting feed that are GMO free. It means that they buy the more expensive soy from South America, which is non-GM soy. the GM soy is cheaper. And most people involved, including the people here, they know that there is no environmental benefit from having a GMO-free, no environmental benefit, no health benefit from having a GMO-free soy than the other soy. And I was actually there a couple of times discussing this with them. And I said, yeah, we know this, but our customers don't know. So they have tested what the customers believed. And I think it was 64% of their customers believed that it was a good sign to say that GMO-free makes a signal of good, better milk in one way. Although the milk became more expensive because the feed was more expensive. So either the farmers made less money out of this or the consumer had a higher price. But this company, they said, well, we are prepared to do this because we think that the competitor that we have, which is so when I'm standing in the shop and trying to choose which milk I'm going to buy, either I choose the local producer or the big Arla, which is a Danish multinational company, because the local dairy company, they believed that the other one needed to change their no GMO policy in a couple of years. And then they believed that, fine, then we can advertise this again. And then we'll say, we are the milk brand that is doing environmentally responsible and so on. Since people believe that, although they knew themselves that this was not true. But again, they need to try to sell milk. I actually wrote an article in the local newspaper about that, and we had some debate. And then a couple of months later, the sticker was gone. So I was quite happy with that. But Europe is the really part of the world which is most skeptic towards this. In other parts of the world, there is much more acreage with GMOs, although there is basically nothing that is used for food. It is either cotton used for clothing or soybean, corn, or oilseed rape and so on. Most of it is used in feed or other things because consumers in most of the world are skeptic. It's not only in Europe. But given the situation that Europe, there is basically nothing grown. There are only very small acreages in a couple of countries, and the rest of the world is using this. So there is a big production of soy and corn, for instance, which is done much cheaper outside of Europe than inside Europe. That's, of course, a problem if you're a European farmers. But then EU steps in here because EU is really, if you boil it down, this is an organization for the competitiveness of European industry and, in European economic sector in general. So this was how EU started once upon a time. And a lot of decisions that are taken with the EU, you cannot understand them if you don't try to think that, we are here to protect the industry. I mean, there's a lot of other things now. It's a lot about immigration, and it's about Ukraine support and so on. But if you boil it down, things that don't benefit the European industry, they have very problems to get through in the EU decision system. And a good example of that is solar panels. After Fukushima in 2011, a lot of countries, particularly Germany, and so decided we should leave nuclear power, we should move over to more sustainable energy solutions, windmills, solar panels, and so on. But at that time, and probably also now, Chinese solar panels were much cheaper than German-produced solar panels. So the German solar panel industry, they asked EU to put tariffs on the Chinese-made ones because they said they are dumping the market. So, and it happened. So between 2013 and 2018, there were tariffs on this. And as it was written here in the Spiegel, this actually means that, of course, we slow down the transition to sustainable energy systems because it became more expensive. So here you can see it was climate against economy, and then economy won. But it's very hard for a politician to motivate. You need to have good arguments if you should motivate protectionism. But here, when it comes to GMO, EU motivates us, it's not because we're protectionist. It's just saying that we have very high standards on food safety and so on. So it's basically protectionist that is disguised as a concern for health and environment. A special thing when it comes to this is actually organic farmers, because organic farming is very big in Europe. The definition of the EU definition of organic farmers basically have three main pillars: no chemical pesticides, no fertilizers unless manure, and no GMOs. And if you don't fulfill these criteria, you can never get the label of organically produced food. And if you don't get the label, then you won't get the extra subsidies that you get it, but maybe more importantly too, you cannot get customers to pay a higher price, because the customer thinks that this is a sign of something, at least it's a sign of less pesticides. So pesticide use in conventional agriculture is the best-selling argument for organic farmers. But just imagine if the potatoes I was showing in the beginning, if they were starting to be sold in Europe, then basically all European conventional potato production would be pesticide-free. So who would like to buy an organic potato for perhaps twice the price of a conventional one, if the organic could not say that the other one is been sprayed by pesticides? So that's really one of the main reason why the organic farmer organization, they have to be against, because they have to protect their business model. So if you put all these things together, farmers, retailers, chemistry industry, organic farmers, and environmental NGOs, these are all actors that are very important in the European decision system. These are the ones that have the lobbyists in Brussels. It's not we who are scientists. We don't spend our funding to go there and try to convince EU that saying that you need to do something about this. So these all, as I showed you, they basically benefit from having a deadlock like this. So I need to speed on now because I should end in a few minutes. But I mentioned this, the genome sequencing and the CRISPR. And CRISPR, that's really something which I think is what will eventually make a game changer here. And I will get back to what I showed you in the beginning, that we had for this, one of these photosynthesis genes we've been working on, we had two variants, one where we had the mutation due to radiation, another due to chemicals, and the third variant where we had the mutation due to the help of agrobacterium. One was GMOs, the others were not a GMO. And I've been using this as an example in my lectures for many years. I say this, I mean, for us they are equivalent, but in society some can be grown without regulation and not the others. So what we set up to do, that was to make another plant using CRISPR that looked basically exactly as the non-GMO plants up here. And then we asked our authorities, if we do it like this, if we do something which is identical to a non-GMO, would it be a GMO or not? Because when the European definition for GMO and the law, and the same in the rest of the world, when that was written back 20 or 30 years ago, of course, no one could imagine that someone would be able to do genome editing in the future. So it was not clear whether they were covered by the regulation or not. The Swedish authorities, after some thinking, said that no, if you don't add any DNA, it cannot be counted as a GMO. And that was a big step forward. This was the first country in the world that took this decision. There was even written about it in Nature and so on. And I used this opportunity. So this one year, 2016, when Sweden was the only country that said that this was not a GMO. So that meant that I could grow CRISPR modified plants in my garden without the permit from the authorities, which I did, and invited one science journalist to share the first CRISPR meal in history. And that was really my 15 minutes of fame, because I was publishing this and it was basically written about it in Science here and in many other media throughout the world. Because this was showing that now we have this technique, we need to find out how to deal with this, or society needs to find out should we regulate it or not. 2 years later came the decision of a European Court of Justice, which is the highest legal body in Europe, and they reverted the decision of the Swedish authorities. So the plant that one day was growing in my garden, not being a GMO, the next day after the decision, it's perhaps a GMO, because the court case was not really about this plant, it was about another plant, but probably the implication would mean that all genome editing may be covered under the GMO legislation. So that was a big setback for us. And it all boils down to the interpretation of the EU GMO definition from 1991, which is not really consistent in a way, and now the court have to interpret what was meant with this. But the situation that we have right now is sort of the opposite of a global harmonization, because in most countries of the world, if you don't add any DNA through genome editing, it's not the GMO, while in EU it is. Quite a few countries haven't made a decision yet. But this creates, of course, an enormous, I guess basically say an insolvable problem for Europe. Because outside of Europe, these plants that have been genome edited but no DNA added, they don't need to be separated. They don't need to be labeled. They can go into all food streams and be put in, I don't know, flour or whatever things, because there is no need for labeling or no need for keeping track of them. But when they enter the border into Europe, they needs to be labeled. They need to be a detection system set up, because that is required by the European authorities. You cannot have GMOs here unless you can trace them. The problem is here that you cannot distinguish them from natural mutants. So it's not possible to make a detection system. And this is, of course, an insolvable problem, a weak problem that Europe needs to do something about, but we still don't know what will happen. So, but for us who wants to use this, what we have been doing or developing in the lab for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years for become useful for society, we need to know, because if CRISPR edited plants will be regarded as GMOs, they could be used. In reality, they will not be used because there is so much of opposition or laws against it and so on. So it is really the key question here. And in order to make genetics of 2020s useful for society, we need to break this vicious circle, because as long as public and consumers think this is something bad, politicians will follow what they think the public believes, and business will follow what they think consumer believe. And then they will not change the status quo that we have right now, because somewhere the laws need to be changed, because with the system that we have right now, all the varieties that are developed throughout the world that will make agriculture much more sustainable, they can never be used. So the public and consumers, they cannot see the benefits. And that's why this circle keeps on rolling and rolling. And I'm sure Bernard will come to it as well, why this is a problem. It's a problem. The skepticism in EU is a problem, even for Africa that are afraid of exporting things to us. It makes Europe more dependent on food import. It makes it de facto impossible for us working in university with public funding to develop varieties that are good, because there are also enormous costs if we want to put them into the market. So it's far beyond the scope of anyone except the biggest multinational companies. And of course, it's never good to have a decision making without scientific evidence. But this was my last slide, and I think I will stop here. And I guess should we have some questions right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. This was absolutely wonderful. There are many questions, and you answer some of these, but actually people are still curious about what is the impact of GMO on the consumer's health, and are GMO foods safe to human body and the environment? So let's start with this one, and after that there are more concrete questions.
The clear message from science that they are no more, no less risky than all other plants. Of course, every new potato variety could be dangerous, but we know that it's not more dangerous if it's been developed using that red technique as compared to all the green techniques. So on average, it's just the same.
Okay, so people are still curious about, you showed two pictures of a rice. So people are curious about what do you mean by golden rice? What exactly is golden rice?
Yeah, the golden rice is a rice where actually some genes have been taken to make rice to produce this carotene, this colorful pigment also in the seed, in the rice.
But for aesthetic purposes or for?
Because vitamin A deficiency is a big problem in big parts of the world.
Yeah.
And this is the precursor of vitamin E. So if we eat this, it will be converted to vitamin A in our body. And rice contains a lot of this. This pigment is sitting on the proteins that I talked about that we are doing research on. So that's where they are bound. So everything which is green on a plant has a lot of precursor of vitamin A. And so has other carrots. They are yellow because they contain this. So it's just about you have inserted a gene that also make the rice produce that compound that otherwise is only produced in the leaf. So this is the difference. And there have been a couple of variants. I think the first type of this, they took some genes from a daffodil, because daffodils, they have a lot of pigments in their petals. I think that in the more modern varieties, I think they took the gene from rice itself. They just changed its expression. But but it makes more vitamin A precursor in the rice.
Okay. So another question with the prospects for GMO. The question is about kidney beans, tomatoes, potatoes. You mentioned about potatoes. They all contain naturally occurring toxins that could be hazardous for our health. What is your opinion about this?
I should say that if you think about genome editing and CRISPR that I talked about, the easiest thing to do with CRISPR, that is to take away compounds that you don't want here, because it's a very efficient way of destroying genes, making point mutations. So if you can sort out the biochemistry, this is the enzyme that produces this compound that you don't want. Then you destroy this gene using CRISPR, and then hopefully the new plant will have less of this. So you could do it with other things, but it's where really genome editing is the very best tool for this.
Yeah. Another of our listeners today is asking about, you could tell him more or her more about the scenario of genome editing in plants for food applications.
Yeah, it's already there. I mean, they have been already last year. They are coming out to the market. There are tomatoes with more of some good healthy compounds, and so that was one of the first markets in Japan and so on. The thing is that in a couple of years, this is exploding to the extent that I'm sure no one will be able to keep track of it, because we could keep track of GMOs because we have to label them and we have to get the permits. If these are not regarded to be GMOs, then of course no one needs to keep track of them. The companies that sell the seeds, they want to keep track of them because they want to know themselves, but not as when they get out to the market. So it will be there. It's just Europe that needs to find a way to handle it, because we cannot stop it from being imported, but the law says that we need to stop it from being imported. So it's a hopeless situation.
Yeah, there are more questions, but I will leave them at the end because I want to give opportunity for our second speaker to have his time to talk. Thank you very much, Stefan. This was Professor Dr. Stefan Jönsson, professor in plant cell and molecular biology at Umeå University, Sweden, and a chair of GHI, Genetically Modified Based Plant Food Working Group. Thank you again. Our second speaker is Dr. Bernard Olo. He's a lecturer of food science and technology at Egerton University in Kenya, and is a member of GHI, Genetically Modified Based Plant Food Working Group. Dr. Olo is going to talk about genetic modification of plant food in Kenya. Dr. Olo is a lecturer of food science and technology, but also he has earned several international awards, including Borland Fellowship from the Michigan State University in the United States, Emerging Leaders Network Award by Institute of Food Technology, among them. Thank you for being with us today, Ben, and over to you.
Thank you, everybody. This is an important opportunity to meet and at least have a conversation with you. I must totally appreciate the presentation that has been done by Professor Jason. That was the best opener to my presentation that I could probably imagine possible, because he has laid down the foundations of genetically modified foods and made it so easy for us to get to understand the science, so that as I'm talking about some aspects of the application, it will be easier for us to just pick that and be able to have a better understanding. So as I've been introduced, I work at GHI University. My name is Bernard Lowe, and my area of specialty is usually food safety. But I have a stint as a Bolog Fellow where I immersed myself into understanding of the genetically modified organisms and their implications, especially for countries such as mine. And today I'm just going to share some thoughts around this as we proceed today. So I'm going to talk about the adoption of GMO crops in Africa, the fact that it's been a very painstaking experience, and to ask the question, where next, given the many issues that are at play with regard to this particular technology. And we will see a lot of parallels between what I'm going to present and what Professor Jackson has already gone ahead to present today. Genetically modified, genetically engineered, transgenic, biotechnology driven. All these are technologies that have been, or terms that have been used to try and explain genetically modified organisms. And the question is it possible that what is in the name? Could it be confusing? Could it be the reason why we still have, after so many years of evidence regarding these foods, no consensus, especially with regard to public and politicians regarding these technologies? So by definition that is given by Codex Alimentarius 2001, and Codex is an international organization whose aim is to create standards to help with trade and harmonization. So Codex says that genetically modified organism is an organism whose genetic material or genetic makeup has been altered in some way and changed through modern biotechnology in a way that does not occur naturally by multiplication or natural recombination. I believe at this point we see parallels with the definitions that Professor Justin was able to share with us. And if you look at that particular definition, you realize from even the examples we've seen before that most plants and animals actually we're using for food today have been modified in one way or another. This has been evidenced by the presentation that has just gone before. And the selections that are involved in these products for many years have led to an alteration in their genetics in some manner. And Professor Jason has just shared with us that different methods are used, whether it is mutagenesis, we've seen radiation, we've seen chemical radiations, and many other technologies that are being used by breeders to ensure that they modify crops to give us the beneficial nutrients that we need or traits that we are seeking. However, it's laudable to see that conventional breeding, which changes the genome of a crop even more significantly, however, there is less consideration, there is less noise with regard to the applications, even though they seem to create more changes to the genome in ways that are usually less certain. And those changes can also be very extensive than those which are inherent through genetic engineering. It is also observed that almost all of the food risks of GMOs are almost all inherent as well in these particular crops that are done by other means. But when it comes to looking at the risks, many times these risks are ignored, as we have seen from the previous presentation. No one seems to ask or question. We only see one red line. The rest of all those other mechanisms, there was not a big question asked around them. So there is a very huge contrast between the considerations that people are making with regard to when they hear this has been genetically modified, vis-a-vis the other methods are being used now for this kind of work. So let's narrow down to the GMO adoption in Africa and the case for Kenya. We're just using this as an example of the many African countries and what they're going through at this moment. So this journey of genetic adoption in Kenya has been here for a while. And dates back from the time when the United States were able to commercialize their first genetically modified organism or crop around 1995. During that time, there was talk about the Cartagena Protocol and the fact that countries needed to either abide by it or not. In Africa, Kenya was one of the first countries to ratify the Cartagena Protocol, which meant that they were going to observe certain rules that were being set to make sure that these genetically modified organisms could be released in a way that is responsible, in a way that has regulation or has been regulated. And as a result of that, Kenya went ahead to develop what is called the National Biosafety Laws, and which established the National Biosafety Authority, a body that is now mandated with the process of regulating genetically modified organisms across the country of Kenya. However, things took a turn in 2012 when there was a cabinet resolution to ban genetically modified organisms. That meant there was no way that you could either buy into the country genetically modified organisms, trade in genetically modified organisms, or take them to market. And 10 years later, which was around 2020, 2021, a conversation ensued, which resulted later into Kenya allowing for commercialization of the first genetically modified crop, which is the genetically modified cotton. So as a result of that, what followed years later, or 1 or 2 years later, actually last year in October, due to the change of government, there was a lifting of this ban that has been there for the last decade or so. And this ban lifting was received by many as the best thing that the new government has done, because it's allowing us a chance to probably import in case of limitations or where we don't have enough grain. And for us, especially in this part of the world, maize grain, especially white maize, is one of the country's staples, or many countries' staples. And therefore, many saw there is an opportunity here now to import this. But however, this jubilation did not stay for a long time, because it was also opposed in the same measure, just as we have seen in the previous conversation, by lobbyists. And they mentioned almost the same things that we did mention early on, which were the concerns about potential risks to health, environment. And as a result, what followed is that the ban was actually temporarily stopped, or the lifting of the ban was temporarily stopped again by a court order. So now I bring us to the wider context of Africa and what's been happening. Because in some scenario, people have probably said, especially when you're talking to the general public, some may have said that this is a foreign technology. So when you look at the GMO landscape in terms of historically, we see that the United States, one of the earliest countries to adopt this particular technology in the US in 1994. And then you see the timeline continues. South Africa, which is the first country in Africa, did adopt the technology in 1997 and commercialized maize at that time. But after that, you don't see, many African countries at all until 2012, when Sudan becomes another country in Africa that already now is able to commercialize the BT cotton. So this is how the landscape looks like. And into 2014, 2015, very little activity, at least on this scale, that is visible. If you look at what I'm calling just the canvas, the GMO canvas in Africa, as you look at it, Africa is wide, big continent. But in terms of places where there is already commercialization of this technology in terms of different crops, you see that very few countries. South Africa still leads with more than a crop, definitely. And then you have a lot of other countries which are just doing genetically modified cotton, Kenya inclusive. And if you look at the global data in terms of the technology adoption across the world for the major crops, which are soybeans, maize, cotton, biotech, canola, and even biotech alfalfa. As you look through this, I hardly saw, an African country here in terms of the volumes that we're producing or that we are doing in terms of genetically modified organisms. So 2012 is a decade ago. And during that time, there was a ban that was due to a cabinet resolution. And what I have on the screen is simply what is available on YouTube about this sitting that it was announced that the GMO in Kenya is banned. And this followed very closely with a study that was done during that time, or a release of a study that was done during that time, which linked the GMO maize to tumors, perhaps in rats. And a year later, actually 2013, that paper was withdrawn, and it was, of course, done by one of the professors from Italy. So as a result of that, of course, Kenya banned the genetically modified organisms. And as a result of that, a lot of other countries in the region, became hesitant. And this stayed for a long time without any modifications or any changes happening in the rest of the continent. 20 years ago, and the 10 years ago, when now Kenya banned this particular technology, the concerns that people had were effects on the environment. What if these genetically modified organisms have an impact on the human health? What about the regulatory competence of the bodies that have been put in place to make sure that this crop or these crops have been modified this way do not just go unchecked? And we have seen from the previous presentation that there is a lot now that has been put in place in terms of legislation and regulations to make sure that GMO can be traded. In addition to this, the concern was, what about socio-economic and ethical issues? What if these genetically modified organisms can lead to changes in humans, perhaps, that will destroy our societies in one way or another? So these were the things. And lastly, there was the reluctance of GMO adoption in the the European Union, which Professor Jashan has alluded to. It's apparent that many African countries, for some reason, considers a lot what the European Union says about something. So in this case, depending on what the European Union says about this crop, we still think that it was one of the reasons that led to saying, let's stop and see what the European Union is going to do about this. So these concerns, however, have not ceased. But something else is happening in Africa, which I want to draw your attention to. This data here is a representation of what's happening with regard to productivity of maize, basically in the East African community, or East Africa, where Kenya is part of that. And one of the states in the United States, which is the Iowa states. And what we see here is in terms of the yields, which are in terms of tons per acre. Over the years, you see that Iowa started here in 1900. The data starts this far, and their production was about 2.5 tons per acre. Over the years, you see there is a tremendous increase to an extent that the average is almost about 12 by the year 2010 per acre. On the other hand, if you look at the East African productivity in terms of yields of maize, you see from 1990 to the year 2010, it's almost stagnant, and it's just below 2 tons per acre. And this begs the question, because one thing is evident here, that between 1900 and up to the year 1960, 1980s, Iowa was able to continuously increase the yields without necessarily, employing the new technology that we're talking about today. That's one thing. But the other thing, if you look at the Eastern African community, we know for sure that there is climate change, there is a lot of increase in pests and diseases. The population is continuously increasing, actually more than 6 times what it was at that time. And this now begs the question, what does Kenya or Africa need to do with regard to the productivity stagnant? Maize is an example. And yet we have also had restrictions with regard to genetically modified organisms technology. So what is possible for this continent, or for Africa, for Kenya to deal with this particular situation? So Africa over the years has developed very stringent rules in line with the rules that have been developed elsewhere for regulations of genetically modified organisms. In Kenya, this work of regulation is with the National Biosafety Authority, and the regulation process is almost just in 2 ways. There is the process itself, and then there is the regulation process. So the process is, if I want to release a genetically modified organisms, there must be proof of concept, product development, and all that. Up to this, you get a distinct and uniform and stable trait. On the other hand, in terms of regulation, there is a package that has to do with making sure there's food safety, environmental safety, National Biosafety Authority is looking at all these things. And then from there, of course, it goes into the Seed or Plant Act National Performance Trials. After that, there is National Variety Release Committee. And for Kenya, they added another one just last year, not last year, but the year 2019, 2020. And the one that they added was the cabinet approval process, which was one more hurdle. Even if you did everything right, you still needed to convince the government and the cabinet as to say to approve the release of a new genetically modified organism. And as we have seen in the previous presentation, the genetic modification has been increasing because many other technologies are coming on board. And one of those is even the CRISPR-Cas, which we've been able to see its applications with the previous presentation. And Kenya, for once, is already using this particular technology and has even gone ahead to ensure that we have even a regulation. And this technology, as we've seen from the previous slides or presenter, is that it's been said to be very targeted, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's even more specific. And furthermore, the regulatory process around this particular technology, as we have seen even from Professor Jackson, is that there is a little bit of a division. And most countries consider that this technology, because it does not require a transfer of genetic material, it should be treated as conventional on the one hand. But then again, we have what has come from the European Union, as we've seen, where they are saying that these technologies, as long as they are later than 2001, then they should be treated as genetically modified organisms. As much as that is the case, Kenya has gone ahead and produced actually a policy. The National Biosafety Authority has already produced guidelines for determining the regulatory process of genome-edited organisms and products in Kenya. And this makes Kenya the #2 country in Africa to have done this. I know many other countries are in the process of at least having a legislation for the genetically modified organism. Now, we come back to the fact that the ban was lifted. And as a result of that ban being lifted, there are many opportunities that people saw, and of course, maybe risk as well. So what triggered the change in the mindset of government, at least at this juncture, to remove the ban that lasted for such a long time? And we can see that there were basically 4 main reasons why this happened. One, the government appointed a task force to look at genetically modified organisms, and they definitely said that there was proper scientific regulations and a proper strong regulatory framework in place in the Kenyan government or in the Kenyan system to regulate these particular products, and therefore it was felt that it's okay for the genetically modified organisms to be released. But second thing could be a possibility of the fact that there is a drought that is raging in this part of the world, the Horn of Africa and most parts of Africa. And so many people are being estimated from the World Health Organization and FAO reports to be looking at what is a probable chance of starvation. The other thing is that the government decided to review this on the basis that they still have a chance to regulate every single crop being released on what is called a case-to-case basis. And that means that every single product will only be released once it is considered as an individual crop through the whole process that I've alluded to before. However, as I said, this did not last much, even though the National Biosafety Authority, immediately the ban was lifted, was able to put up this particular advert asking those who would be interested in bringing any commodity into Africa that is into Kenya that is genetically modified to comply with certain rules. It says here the National Biosafety Authority draw attention to persons that are wishing to deal with the said products to provide, to look at sections 18, 20 and such, and so that they can be able to comply with those regulatory frameworks to be able to import the genetically modified organisms. But as I said, that did not last. And the ban lifting resulted or was met with great and brute force by opposition. As you can see here, the anti-GMO crusade, lifting their banners, and some of the things that they've said in this particular placards are in Swahili, and I'll probably interpret a bit of that. But you can see that they're very strategic in their communication. So, for example, at the center here, you see there are some rats there, and the rats seem to have swollen parts, which seems to suggest that there is an association between the genetically modified organisms and the swelling that you see on rats. And it says there, vyakula vya GMO vimehusishwa na viini vinavyosababisha ugonjwa wa saratani. The genetically modified organisms have been associated with microorganisms or with certain chemicals that could lead to cancers, as you can see from that diagram. On the other hand, they also display the picture of this young smiling baby. And the question there wanasema athari za vyakula vya GMO hupitishwa kwenye kizazi ijayo, which simply means that any impact of these genetically modified organisms is going to be passed onto the generations that are yet to come. And so you see very strategic communication that plays not just with the mind, but also plays a lot with emotions. And as a result of this, of course, you see the headline, the High Court puts the brake on the plans to import genetically modified organisms. And what were the allegations that were presented in court? One, that the genetically modified organisms will eradicate indigenous seeds. And the second thing was that the lifting of this regulatory barrier was done without proper information sharing among the citizenry or public participation. Normally they call it public participation. And the next thing they said was that there's a possibility of genetic use restriction technology. Some of you may have heard of this before, the so-called terminator gene, which, to the best of my knowledge, is not in use. And Professor Jackson could probably talk to this when he gets the time. But that was the allegation that was presented before court. And the last one was that, of course, adoption of genetically modified organisms and their importation to the country would disparage the rights of peasant farmers. And even those people were working in rural areas. So these were the allegations that the court considered, and as a result, put a stop to this process. But the beautiful thing this time around is that, unlike before, there seemed to be a change in the sense that it's now the government itself that are taking the pro approach. And in this case, we see here the Attorney General has gone back to court, and they are presented what they are thinking is enough refutation to say that the organization that presented about genetically modified organisms do not have facts, and they are requesting the court to reconsider that decision through an appeal, so that the development of genetically modified organisms can proceed on in Kenya. But essentially, when you look at the African continent and these issues that are under consideration, the questions beg, what are the things or what are the fears that this part of the continent has with regard to genetically modified organisms? And the fears generally can be divided into whether they are safe, and we have seen some questions have been asked in this regard. The other question is about what about safety to the environment, and the next one is about the social aspects, whether this is going to destroy our social fabric and seed systems, for example, because we knew that our farmers would share seeds between one another. And the other one is a question of ethno and religious characteristic. Are we going to be playing God by manipulating genetic material of crops that, according to us, were created by God to perform a certain function? Of course, food safety becomes one of those very critical issues that people are concerned with, and this is one of the things that people hold, political people or any other person, they hold this as one of the main reasons for their discouraging of this particular technology. However, as we know that the regulations that have been put in place have made it very stringent for these foods, that there are certain food safety criteria that has to be achieved by these particular foods for them to be released in the market, including the testings of whether there is any allergenicity to these kind of foods. There are a lot of food safety protocol that is followed to just ensure that these genetically modified organisms are not any different than the conventional counterparts. In spite of that, we also know that countries from Africa and every other country, they have put enough regulations, just as I've shown before, to take care of these particular products. One question that bags in all this scenario, and we have seen the mirroring between Europe and what's happening in Africa, is what is the voice of science in all this debate. And fortunately, the scientific community in Kenya recently, more than 90 scientists, of course, from the Network of African Science Academy, they called African countries to embrace modern biotechnology through this press conference. And in their estimation, they're saying that these technologies could not only improve agricultural productivity, but also they feel as though that they have, they are just the same. The products of this technology is just the same or equivalent to their conventional counterparts. And they also even went tight to say that as much as we're still in the place where we are debating all these ideas of whether Africa should embrace biotechnology or not embrace biotechnology, the drought situation in Kenya is continuing to increase. And 20 to 23 are still counties in this nation or this part of the world are in a very bad state with regard to the state of the food security situation. And it's become almost an international disaster of some sort. So in spite of all this picture, there is a lot also that is going on in this area of genetically modified organisms, even though there is all these divisions that we have seen before. For example, from the year 2016, which I didn't show in the previous slide, to 2022, 10 more African countries have been able to commercialize, different genetically modified organisms based on this, what they feel is the specific trait that they're looking for. Of course, these countries include South Africa, one of the oldest one, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Nigeria, just to name a few. And that list continues here. So we can see that since 2019, for the Kenyan situation, we were able to then commercialize BT cotton from 2019-2020. And as a result of the commercialization of these products, certain baseline surveys that have been done shows that the farmers have expressed satisfaction, at least in terms of the yields that they're receiving. And they are also saying that BT cotton has given them respite from, the raging drought situation. And they're also saying they've seen significant reduction, of course, in terms of the spraying that they need to do for their crops and general management practice for the diseases, and especially in this case, the African bollworm. So this gives us more data on what is happening in Africa in terms of what crops are they currently bringing on board in terms of commercializing, and what are the current status and the benefits that the farmers in these particular countries are seeing as benefits of the technology. So from South Africa, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and many more that are not on this slide and some on this other slide are already showing that farmers are saying that they're benefiting, and they are tangible, evidence in terms of whether it is reduced pesticide usage. Sometimes it's in terms of higher yields in spite of the changing weather conditions. And so these are things that are happening in Africa and in Kenya in spite of this cloud of where, Africa needs to move as a continent. So from the time that I spent at Michigan State University, I took some time to look at the African situation, and particularly with regard to how can the genetic modification, or how can genetically modified organisms adoption be advanced in the continent, particularly looking at Kenya specifically. And one of the things that came out clearly was the fact that it required to have what is called political goodwill. But at the same time, we also realized that what needs to happen is that there has been a lot of communication, and some of which has been really miscommunication, and that there is a need to shift the paradigm in terms of the communication, to communicate a new paradigm for effective risk and benefit communication. And in terms of the communication, one of the things that we learned was the fact that there could be need, especially for scientists dealing in this area, to practice values of, first of all, of course, when there is competence, of course, there is integrity, authenticity, transparency, warmth, neutrality, and even passion. And then we also realized that the risk communication around genetically modified organisms could be more targeted, especially with regard to talking to the middle class who are the influencers, sometimes media influencers. Farmers as well should be able to hear directly from scientists rather than just hearing from the political class, and even housewives. That would be helpful in advancing this particular debate. And apparently it was also evident that then the young scientists who are coming up should also begin to be very tactful, or be taught or be trained to be tactful in their communication, so that the kind of miscommunication that we've seen before does not persist. So in terms of the framework of sharing information on genetically modified organisms, we looked at making sure that there is already the way that biotechnology is helping, which we have seen in the previous slides. If we can be able to package the benefits of this vis-a-vis the risks, that would be a starting point for this conversation. And then the second one is to just look at the pipeline of genetically modified organisms. What is in store? What are scientists working on currently that would be beneficial to our farmers? That too would add value to this particular conversation. And then in addition to that, it is also very evident that we should be able to look at communicating from the point of what do we want to achieve with that communication, and looking at it from the point of starting with the end in mind. Now, in spite of this scenario about the communication situation in the country, you still see, and here is two very important people, political class leaders, and what you can see here is, for example, the first leader is saying, an experiment on rats, fed maize resulted in kidney disease, mammary tumors. It was his findings that the cabinet resolved to impose the ban on the GMO in 2012. These key findings remain valid to date. And the other very also prominent personality in Kenya also says the GMO ban was not accidental. The president has been against the bans for years and has just been waiting for the occasion that he becomes president to allow it. This about the people making money, this about people making money, and not about the safety of the welfare of the Kenyans. So you see that in spite of what science has said, there is still miscommunication, and many times it's coming from very high places with regard to genetically modified organisms. And the question begs, how best do we deal with such? As you can imagine, I mentioned from the beginning that Kenya banned genetically modified organisms in 2012. That has been 10 years of research data being collected and collated out there. But you see that some people are still stuck with whatever it is that was given as a result of the ban, which was in 2012. So what should Africa do? And this is being replicated almost all across Africa, because many times Kenya plays a very important role in technology dissemination in this part of the continent. In 2012, when the first ban was put in place, scientists began to warn them that the moratorium or the banning of genetically modified organisms was not helpful to the country, because it would restrict the country's ability to deal with the changing climate and the dire need for food security. And this was 10 years ago. But what we have seen since then is that this year particularly, and starting from last year, the drought is continuing to rage, not just in Kenya, but in many other parts of the world. And as a result of that, the question is there a role whatsoever that genetically modified organisms can play in the face of this ravaging climatic change? Is it possible? And the other question that I usually would like to bring on the table is that for 10 years, for a nation such as Kenya, we have been without genetically modified organisms. Is our situation better than it was? Is it getting better as a result of the ban that we imposed? Anyway, so we see that if genetically modified organisms is blocked, there is already an emergency situation that the World Food Program is already saying that up to 3.5 million people in this part of the world, and this was some months ago, and I know it's continuing to get worse because the rains are almost delayed in this part of the world. And so is there enough, maize out there, because apparently it's not here, that could be available, which is not genetically modified, to be able to feed the population that is hungry until we have grown some of the food that we need to grow to get us to the point where we are sufficient in terms of food production. In my analysis, the critical factors that should be considered in this debate, as I wind up, I think, is that the food system transformation is vital at this point. First of all, to make sure that we can feed people sufficiently, but also to take into cognizance the fact that there is a lot that is happening in terms of the global warming, climate change, drought, on the one hand, yet on the other hand, floods. And in that debate, what should be important is to see and ask ourselves as policymakers and people in government positions, what are the options available? And possibly, can genetically modified organisms play a role there? And the second thing that I feel is important in terms of success factors is that many times, one of the things that I didn't raise before, but which has been raised in some quarters, is the fact that the growing of genetically modified organisms could lead to resistant pests, to the BT technology, for example. And what I would suggest in this case is to make sure that countries, such as mine, have a national coordinated and orchestrated response mechanism, because growing of genetically modified organisms gives restrictions or gives particular reference to how these microorganisms or these foods should be handled, should be grown, to avoid them getting into contact or contaminating the environment in any way. These are mechanisms that are being described in the release protocols. But it should be that the countries such as ours then puts into place a coordinated system that would ensure that they're on top of things when it comes to the regulation of genetically modified organisms from developing, pest resistance or even herbicide resistance. And that will go hand in hand with making sure there's data collection, which is timely, but also utilization of the same. One of the things that has been criticized and has been the major concern for most parts of Africa is about the access to seed. There seems to be an understanding that genetically modified organisms or genetically modified seeds is a foreign technology. As a result, these seeds are going to be available through the foreign mechanisms, and of course that the seeds are going to cost money. And some of our farmers are used to just sharing their seed, and therefore the question has been begging, what should be done to ensure access, autonomy over the seed system? Is the adoption of genetically modified organisms in Africa going to interfere and perhaps dilapidate the seed system? And on this point, it is important to realize that already in the setup that we are, yes, we have a few farmers or farmers that are sharing the seed, but there are also farmers already now who are buying hybrid seeds. And in this context, especially in Africa, for example, the BT maize that is being developed in Africa for either for drought resistance or even for drought tolerance, is being developed between Carlo, which is an Kenyan organization, IITF, which is an organization that is operating in Africa in terms of technology transfer. And as a result, it is a technology, or it is a seed system that will be available just like the hybrid seed system will be available. However, I must reiterate that for us to enhance the adoption of technology, there should be an assurance about the access and autonomy over the seed system. The paper I'm showing here is co-authored by my mentor from Michigan State University, Professor Karim, who is at the center there. And they came up with at least 4 mechanisms that a country such as Kenya can be able to do to make sure that the seed system becomes autonomous but also accessible. I would also like to suggest that one of the things that lead to blockage and delays in the process of biotechnology, and especially in genetically modified organisms, is usually the tedious process of ensuring that these food products are not just regulated, but then are finally released into the market. And yet there is a concept of what is called data transferability. And here the question I'd like to ask the African countries would be, would it probably beneficial to use the concept of data transferability? For example, if Kenya, which is very close to Uganda, is done all it needs to do to make sure that BT cotton perhaps is approved, I know there is autonomy in terms of countries, but could it be perhaps possible to say this has been done by our counterparts in Kenya, and the conditions may be a little bit different. In that case, we just do a field trial, but the whole process, can we use data transferability? And if that were the case, then the question would be, is it possible then to have an African common system of biotechnology transfer, perhaps an African food safety authority? Last but not the least is the question of political goodwill. And in my personal estimation, the political goodwill could be a very good sweetness in the cup of tea of these genetically modified organisms, but it could also be laced a little bit with kryptonite. And by that, what I mean is, it is possible during a certain regime to support genetically modified organisms. But what if that changes? A different regime comes on board, as we have seen happening in the Kenyan scenario. I think that as much as political goodwill is important, what is most important is that that political goodwill should be a political goodwill that seeks to base its decisions on science. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for the opportunity. I will be available for any questions or comments. Thank you. Back to you, Diana. I hope you can hear me.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Very emotional presentation and a little bit even passionate. So we like very passionate about what is happening in Kenya and in the whole African continent. For me, like, it's not only miscommunication, but also perception built perception for many years, and probably this is really difficult to be overcome. So there are many questions, and some of them are for Professor Jansson as well. So probably he can appear on the screen as well, so I can ask you both. But the first question is for you, Ben. Many people think that when the gene editing of a seed deprive actually the crops for multiplying later, and because they think that the seed is not capable of growing a new crop after that. So is it something typically for crops in Africa, and if this is causing the distress among policymakers and everyone there, because they worry that of these, gene modified crops that are not going to be able to be reused several times?
You don't need to worry, because that's not true.
Yeah, I wanted Prof. Justin to answer to that as well. But as I know the fact that the Terminator technology is not in use, but is more authoritative on that, and I would like to hear what he's going to say.
Do you both see a shift or transition in acceptance of genetically modified food, and what are the current ethical issues related with it? Kind of related question to the previous one.
Yes, I would say that if one of the books that I've read is called The Enemies of Innovation, and it's written by Juma Cleopas, who was a Kenyan and at Harvard University. And in that book, it gives a historical perspective of technologies that have gone before and the resistance that those technologies achieved. And as I read that book, it gave me a little bit of a glimmer of hope, because at one point, even coffee was resisted. Coffee maker machine was thoroughly restricted. And I felt maybe it's possible that with time, as we continue to communicate, as we continue to have evidence of countries that have been consuming these foods for a long time without any impact, as we continue to see, for example, our president the other time said he's been to some of these countries, he's eaten genetically modified organisms, he's not developed anything that is peculiar. I believe that at some point in time in the future, maybe not very near, but this may change.
Yeah,
I agree. It will change. I don't know how. If you asked me 20 years ago, I would have said that it's probably would have changed already now, but it's still not there. But I mean, it's just a matter of time. I mean, it's something which is good, good and favorable and economically feasible will finally take over, I'm sure.
Similar to food irradiation, some of the countries are still worrying about it. Yeah. Okay, another question. So how can we ensure that biodiversity balance remains intact If organizations produce genetically modified products that are sterile, not how will the bees and insects collect nectar? This is the case currently with some F1 hybrids, not genetically modified, that are sterile so that they don't produce seeds and don't need to attract insects. If all genetically modified crops are designed to attributes other than biodiversity balance, then flora and fauna could be compromised. How can we ensure this is not the case?
We don't need to ensure it because it is not the case. I mean, you're right. Some F1 hybrids may have problem, not really that they are sterile. It's more that their offspring is not as productive as the original ones. So, and that's, and if a GM or gene-edited strain would end up being put in a F1 hybrid, then of course it will be the same there as well. So there is nothing dependent on whether there is a gene that have been transferred with Agrobacterium in there or not. It has nothing to do with this. And as I say, it's possible to both through traditional breeding and through gene technology to make plants that are sterile. That's not the problem, but I'm really, why should someone want that? There was a discussion, as you brought up, this GHI technology, whether you should make all GMOs sterile. But there was a very interesting situation for a while that there was, in one country, it was said it was forbidden to have sterile GMOs because then you cannot take the seed of them. And in another country, it was forbidden to not have them sterile. So it's just you can do whatever you want, really, but that you can do both with traditional breeding and with GMOs. But in order to make things very efficient, of course, it's much better if they will produce seeds. Otherwise, you need to redo it all the time, and that becomes very expensive.
Yeah, you see questions are gravitating around the same thing because people really worry. There's another question about is the food safety linked with halal and how genetically modified foods from plants can be addressed to this issue?
Whether the food safety is linked to halal, you mean?
Yeah, halal.
The Islamic code of practice.
Yeah.
Great. I'm not an expert on halal, but I would think that if the food safety mechanism that is employed in ensuring that the food is safe for human consumption uses something that we call substantial equivalence. So we look at this particular food product in terms of the general characteristics, which is what they do in crop breeding. And then we look at it in terms of the nutritive content, whether that's the same. Then we go down to the protein, whether that is the same. Then we go to whether those proteins can have allergies. And to ensure that that particular crop now becomes basically substantially equivalent to the conventional counterpart. Now, on that basis alone, I wouldn't have any reason why it wouldn't fit into the halal system unless the person asking the question says something with regard to whether the halal rules prohibit, from genetic modification.
Maybe this is what the person wanted to ask. Okay.
Yes, when they made the halal rules, they didn't consider whether the techniques of breeding. I'm pretty sure that we are considering whether food was safe or whether it was religiously correct or not. So I don't think it will have anything to do with halal at the end.
Yeah, but I'm sure that there will be lots of research on this later. Okay, so another thing, genetically modified food has been used by some countries for more than 15 years. Any risk assessment conducted on this? And if yes, what was the outcome?
Thank you very much.
There is no risk. There is no increased risk. There have been enormously amounts of risk research being done. I mean, it's billions of dollars that's been spent on this, and no risk have been identified that are in excess to risks that are with agriculture as such. I mean, the way of producing new varieties doesn't have an impact of the risk of them. That's
until the consumer is convinced, they'll be spending probably more of thousands of dollars. Yeah. Okay. Another question for you. So, whether genetically modified crops can successfully take place in a regular agriculture system in India. This is particular for India. Previously, trials were not promising there. So this is more of a comment or a question in between.
I guess in order to be useful, the varietals must be good, of course. If they are, it doesn't help taking something that grows well in India and try to grow it here. That we all know. So someone needs to develop good varieties, and again, breeders are doing this all the time. Right now, they have to do it without using the most efficient tools that there are on the market. They need to use suboptimal tools. But the goals are the same. They are trying to make varieties producing a lot of food which is safe and to a cheap price and with less impact on the environment. That's what everyone wants. So it's just whether we should make this tries easier or harder. This is what we're discussing here.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. I'd like to add my voice to that and just say that the goal, as he says, the goal of this, we're not just transforming for the sake of transforming. We are transforming because we are thinking we are going to end up with superior quality seed. And as he says, if it doesn't work in an environment, then it is not superior, and therefore then we don't modify. We don't waste time on it. We take something that could be able to work and improve on the productivity.
But it's been a problem because basically since the costs have, and it's a regulatory cost that's been so huge. So if one variety of maize was produced once, and that's the only one that is allowed, then of course you have to test whether it will work everywhere. But that's just because the regulatory system is so prohibitive. If it was easy, then you can take this particular gene and put in any maize variety, and then you will get the trait there. But that's not possible because then you need to go through the whole process again, and no one can afford that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, 3 more questions. So what is your opinion about the technical, risk, legal and political differences between genetically modified and genetically engineered and other NBTs?
Yeah, if you would ask me as a scientist, I think it's actually impossible to see any borders here, what is different and what is not different. I understand if you are working in law, you have to try to formulate something. But as a biologist, this distinction doesn't make sense, really. It's to say if you can reach the same goal, exactly the same goal with different techniques, then the only thing which is important is how the plant look at the end. And it's just ridiculous that we have the situation in Europe right now that exactly the same plant that you could be either a GMO or not a GMO, just depending on sort of how its ancestors were. And it doesn't make any sense at all. But you have to deal with the law one way or the other. But to try to make biology to law is not so easy.
So what is your point of view, in year 10, 20 years, what will be your take, how things going to be changed with respect to acceptance of genetically modified, especially in African continent? This is more for Ben, but Stefan, you can also share your opinion.
Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's a lot that is going on in the laboratories all across Africa, and different technologies from, of course, the genetic transformations to gene editing. A lot of countries are already getting into that space, even though, as I said, the perceptions in many African countries probably are stuck there. But I believe that what we are seeing, for example, in Kenya, where there's a shift, especially in the government, and the government is taking the bulls by its own in this case to say the ruling that was made was not based on science, and they have evidence they are using to show that these genetically modified organisms have been eaten elsewhere for decades, as we've seen, and without any results that there is any significant difference than the normal or than the conventional counterparts. I believe that with that happening, it will be an opportunity for the other countries, because many times what happens is they wait on each other, politically to take a direction. And so if, for example, Kenya succeeds with ensuring that this ban has been lifted and the country is able to proactively continue to pursue genetically modified organisms, of course, in the light of other technologies, then there is a possibility that there is a wind of change that is happening.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to add something, Stefan, or to? Okay, the last question. I just wanted to, I was trying to keep it for the last question because I need we to finish in some kind of positive note. So, is genetically modified will be a tool in achieving zero hunger goals in respect to Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes.
I believe it's a tool. Yeah. Yes.
So we have to continue educating people. We have to continue telling them what can bring genetically modified of plant foods. So basically, this is why we are there, to educate people. So thanks a lot, both of you, Ben and Stefan. These were Professor Stefan Janssen and Dr. Bernard Olo. Thank you for your excellent presentation and very informative. Again, I want to take a huge thanks to ICC for hosting us, and for our team, Nicola Stanley, Dr. Gerhard Schleining, and Dr. John Tang. Thank you all. Thank you for our audience. Thank you for your questions. There were so many questions, and thank you for your great support. Again, stay tuned for our upcoming second GHI World Congress on Global Food Safety and Security, 18th to 20th of March next year, 2024, in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. And please submit your abstract after 1st of April. For more information, visit www.ghiworldcongress.org. You can see this in a chat as well. Thank you again for being with us today, and see you next time. Stay safe, happy, healthy, and curious, and don't forget to smile.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, and bye for your time.